Our story continues. Achilleos found Cyrinthia not where he had expected, that expectation being that Cyrus's daughter would be assisting Odyssean with his task. Instead, the hunter discovered the dark-haired woman sitting where she could see the proceedings, but was far enough away to not be a part of them. Her eyes were of course on Odyssean. To ask otherwise would have been unthinkable even to Achilleos. Although as the archer approached, his own keen gaze noticed hers surreptitiously shift to Lilia, then back to the son of Diomedes again.
"I brought you some water,"
he said, as a way of interjecting himself into her private world. Cyrinthia took it with a nod of thanks and drank far more from it than Achilleos assumed that she would have, which meant that she'd been sitting out here for quite some time, just watching. Likely Cyrinthia had run all the way here fearing some imagined danger, whereas he had taken his time, somehow aware that Odyssean was utterly safe. When she was done, he took the sack of water back and remarked,
"It's truly astonishing, isn't it, Sari?
Yes, it is.
I've been his friend since we were children."
Without asking, he took up a place next to her. It was as forward as he dared get. Despite his sometimes gregarious appearance, Achilleos was much more at home in the forest, alone with his quarry. In social circumstances, he felt only one step above Mandelm, and, where the woman next to him was concerned, just as awkward. His comment caused her to look at him with such intensity that Achilleos wondered what he had said wrong. Cyrinthia appeared poised to say something, but it was almost a full minute before a single word escaped her lips.
Why are the two of you friends, Achilleos? You seem so different in so many ways.
He had no answer, save,
"Because we just are, I guess. We were friends the moment that we met."
He shrugged.
"Children are like that."
I suppose.
Cyrinthia thought for a moment, then asked,
Is she what you would dream of?
Now the subject he had expected was at hand. Cyrinthia had merely taken a more circuitous route to it.
"Lilia, she is fair, to be honest, and no man would let his gaze pass over her without noticing that. But the same could be said for others, not merely her."
He could barely have been more blunt, in his eyes, but she seemed to not understand that he meant her.
I know that to us she is exotic, and I can understand why Odyssean would fall for her, but it was all so quick, Achilleos.
It had been like that for him, in a sense. One day he had only known Sari the impish child. The next day, there had stood the beautiful woman. Achilleos had been so lost in amazement of the change that for the next week, he went without a single catch to his credit. Cyrinthia was silent for a time, and Achilleos satisfied himself with being in her company, which was how such situations generally ended. They watched as Odyssean greeted one Parthian after another. Each time he succeeded in doing whatever it was he did. Achilleos noticed both his friend and the one touched share a look of immense satisfaction.
"Is that the way you felt? Like them?"
He finally dared ask.
Yes?
She replied, but the way she said it made the hunter not so certain.
"Have you been able to do anything?"
This time, there was a pause, followed by,
I don't know.
"How could you?"
I don't know.
her tone growing more adamant. Normally, Achilleos would have left it at that, but this time he could not.
"Sari, what do you mean?"
Her gaze shifted not to him, but rather her hands.
I feel it, just as I know many of them do, but that's all. I haven't noticed anything else different around me. I've tried to think of things, make them happen, but as far as I know, nothing has.
"Still, I would have thought by now that..."
So would I. Believe me, so would I.
She responded with a steely look in her eyes. It made no sense to him. Lilia had already displayed several instances of ability, such as making flowers and berries bloom on bushes, or healing some of the minor cuts suffered by one of the mounts. She had also summoned a rabbit to them, saving Achilleos from having to hunt, but leaving the archer feeling as if somehow the animal had been cheated of its chance to survive.
What about you?
His companion asked without warning.
I haven't seen anything from you either.
In truth, Achilleos did feel something within him seeking to grow, but he had done his best to smother it. He had told no one of that decision. Many might desire the gift that Odyssean offered, but not his best friend. Achilleos was satisfied being who he was, a hunter and a simple man.
I suspect that I'm not the best student for Odyssean. Not at all.
But no one taught him. Not really. With Odyssean, it came as sudden as the storm over Sarum, which apparently was caused by him too.
Odyssean was pressed on all sides, Sari. He was accused of a brutal murder by brother Michelius. The Inquisitors would have dragged him back off to the cathedral, probably to burn as a fiend. He had no choice.
She was not convinced.
It was all terrible. But why at that time? Why not when his family slowly and horribly perished from plague? Why not then? Why even him, for that matter? There are so many others who've suffered worse, and yet we've never heard of such an astounding thing before. It would have reached even Sarum, you know that.
Even as the hunter nodded in agreement to this argument, Cyrinthia went on.
And why not Mendeln then? He suffered as much too. His family was wiped out and his brother was accused of a terrible crime. It could have been him, but it wasn't. I've seen nothing unusual about Mendeln. Have you?
Her mention of Mendeln made Achilleos flinch. Cyrinthia noticed his reaction and her eyes narrowed.
What is it, Achilleos? What about Mendeln? Is he manifesting abilities like his brother?
It was not the suggestion of that which had caused the archer to flinch, but rather a brief and unexpected recollection of another time, another place. As Cyrinthia had spoken of Odyssean's sibling, Achilleos had relived the moment when he and his other friend had inspected the mysterious stone near Sarum. Not only had the archer seen again Mendeln freezing in place before it, but he had also re-experienced touching it himself, and the awful emptiness that had overwhelmed him until he had managed to pull free.
No.
He finally managed.
No. Nothing like Odyssean.
Achilleos, what?
She said, unconvinced. Without warning, a tremendous sense of fear overcame the hunter, but not fear for himself. He had an awful feeling that something was happening to Mendeln at this very moment. Achilleos leaped to his feet, startling his companion.
What is it? What's wrong?
He wanted to answer her, but the urgency he felt was too strong. Without a word, Achilleos began running. He ignored Cyrinthea's concerned call after him, but barely out of the sight of the woman he loved, Achilleos came to a dead stop. The fear for Mendeln had not lessened any, but the archer hesitated to begin to run anew. The truth was, Achilleos had no idea just where Odyssean's brother had gone. The streets through which Mendeln moved were oddly empty, and the buildings around him had suddenly taken on an unsettling gray cast. There was no wind whatsoever and not the slightest sound. Mendeln would have felt very alone, save for one thing. He was still surrounded by the shades of guards Odyssean had slain. Since their arrival, it had taken monumental effort on his part to keep from screaming out the truth to others. Either these shadows of men existed, or he had gone mad. Or both. Mendeln did not know which could be worse. He only knew that he just wanted to tell someone what was happening to him, but he had not. He had said nothing even when they had arrived in Partha, where his hopes that the ghosts would leave him had dissipated the moment the first of the shades passed through into the town. Until then, Mendeln had believed that this haunting would be temporary. Now he feared that the dead would always be with him. Fear was perhaps no longer the right word, though. Certainly they kept him anxious, but the more they were around him, the less frightened he became. They did nothing but stare, not in condemnation, but as if awaiting some word from him. So far, though, Mendeln had said little directly to them. He had asked them to please kindly go away, but since they had not obeyed, he had seen no reason to continue any further attempt at conversation. As he continued walking through town, Mendeln began noticing peculiar signs of age on the buildings, as if Partha were some ancient place long abandoned. The shift became more apparent with each step. The grayness grew darker, veering toward the black. This was not right, he realized. Where was everyone? Where was Odyssean, after whom he had been chasing? Mendeln was worried about his brother, especially what the Parthans might do. He recalled too vividly what had happened in Sarum, where people who had known Odyssean all his life had turned on him. But then there arose a sight ahead of Mendeln that made him falter in his steps and forget all about his brother. He spun around with the intention of fleeing, only to find himself facing the very direction he had just abandoned. A direction that led to a long-neglected cemetery. A cemetery that, from its ancient state, surely could not be Partha's. With the shades of dead men already surrounding him, Odyssean's brother could see nothing but ill coming from entering the overgrown burial site. Yet when he tried to back away, the cemetery only drew nearer. Nevertheless, Mendeln tried one more step back, and in the next breath, he found himself standing within the ruined grounds. A choking sound was all that he could muster as he tried to come to grips with what was happening. He prayed that it was only a bad dream, but he knew otherwise. Mendeln then thought of his blackouts and wondered if this was some bizarre continuation of them. He certainly had no other answer. He noticed that the shades of the dead guards had not entered with him. They drifted beyond the arched gateway as if the winged gargoyle he saw above kept them at bay. For the first time, Mendeln would have liked their company, if only because their comparative familiarity. But now he was completely alone, facing who knew what. As he started to turn his gaze back, what felt like a hand pushed him deeper into the cemetery. Stumbling several steps, Mendeln glanced over his shoulder. He immediately swallowed. Naturally, there was no one there. The farmer glanced down at the first of the graves. A crescent-shaped stone marked the spot. The grave had been dug so long ago that it was infested with generations of weeds and grass, and had even sunken in a bit. He glanced away again, then eyed the marker one more time. Barely legible in the odd, gray shadows was the same script that he had seen on the stone near Sarum. Despite himself, Mendeln grew fascinated by the revelation. Keeping respectful to the grave, he knelt to the side, then leaned toward the stone. Up close, Mendeln was able to verify what he had seen. Many of the very same symbols ran along the crescent, but in patterns that he did not recognize. He ran his fingers over the first line. He could sense some sort of power emanating from the symbols. Mendeln had heard of the words of power, such as the mage clans supposedly used at times, and he could only surmise that these were such. Looking up, Odyssean's brothers surveyed the seemingly endless field of stones. The graves were marked in a variety of manners. In addition to crescents, there were star-shaped slabs, squat rectangular ones, and more. Surveying the landscape ahead, Mendeln even spotted one overlooked by a towering, winged statue bearing a weapon in one hand. Drawn by that statue, he slipped among the graves in order to get a better look. Fascination replaced dread. He had to learn more. Was this some repository of the dead of the mage clans? If so, did they have some tie to what was happening to him, and to Odyssean for that matter? Until now, he would have doubted it. What little he knew from merchants indicated that the once powerful clans had all but shut themselves off from the world as they continued their arcane duels of wit against one another. They would barely have time to bother with a pair of simple farmers. Even though the statue was some distance away, deep within the cemetery, it seemed to Mendeln that he had barely begun moving toward it when suddenly it loomed over him. He paused, trying to understand what it was supposed to be. A winged being, with a face hooded save for glimpses of a mouth and some cascading hair? But it wore a robe and a breastplate somewhat akin to that of the cathedral's inquisitors, but sculpted to resemble some finer material. The breastplate had a script on it, more words in the same mysterious language. Mendeln glanced at the wings again, realizing that they were different from those from birds. What he had taken for feathering looked, when studied closer, more of an artist's rendition of flame. Mendeln had never heard of any creature or spirit with such wings, not even the stories that Mother had told him when he was just a very young child. In the giant figure's left hand, it held a great sword whose tip rested the base beneath the statue. The other hand pointed down, not merely, it seemed to Mendeln, indicating the grave beneath, but also those around it. He had the distinct impression that this was supposed to mean something to him, but what, Odyssean's brother could not say. He was a patient man in general, but someone appeared to be trying, very successfully, to draw him past his limits.
All right then,
he shouted, his voice echoing over and over in the silence.
if you want something from me, then tell me what it is. Tell me. I demand it.
The moment that he finished, a grated sound filled his ears. Swallowing, Mendeln watched in horror as the statue's pointing hand turned enough so that it now indicated what was written on the base. He waited for the winged guardian to do something else, but it simply froze once more. Slowly, he built up the nerve to look down at what was below. The same ancient script greeted him.
But I cannot read it,
he muttered.
I do not know what any of it says.
Squinting, Mendeln attempted to recall the words that had come unbidden to him that frightening time when the demon had caught him alone in the woods. He remembered the images in his head and the sounds of the words, but they were still not enough to help Mendeln with what now lay before him. Weary of the futility of this nightmare, Mendeln finally dared lean on the gravestone, and he studied each mark. His mouth formed shapes, but that was all. Nothing, absolutely nothing made sense.
What does it say?
He growled under his breath.
What does it say? The dragon has chosen you.
Mendeln jerked to his feet. He had heard a voice like that once before back in Sarum. It was akin to the voice of Cyrus, after he had been killed. Part of him wanted to scream for this new one to get out of his head, but another part fixed on what he had been said. The dragon has chosen you. He stared at the ancient script and read it anew.
The dragon has chosen me. You. The dragon has chosen you.
And suddenly, Odyssean's brother could read that line. More importantly, the other symbols now made more sense. Mendeln felt that he was now on the verge of discovering the meanings of all of them, and, in doing so, discovering the truth about what was happening. But what did the phrase actually relate to? Kneeling close again, Mendeln studied the symbol representing the most important word. Dragon. A loop twisting into itself. A thing without beginning or end. Mendeln knew that the dragon was from the legends. Why would this mark represent such a creature? And why such a creature at all?
What happened?
Mendeln quietly asked, then frowned when he noted how he had phrased the question. He had meant to ask, what is happening? Why would he... The dirt beneath his hand suddenly shifted, as if something beneath was seeking to dig its way out. Eyes round, Mendeln scrambled back. In doing so, he inadvertently threw himself atop another of the graves where, to his further dismay, something also began to stir beneath. Worse, it began to register on him that graves everywhere were shifting, stirring. Mounds of upturned dirt decorated many already, and Mendeln's imagination pictured skeletal figures readying to emerge. But just as when it seemed that his imagination would become a monstrous reality, there formed in the shadow of the winged statue a figure entirely shrouded in black. Mendeln had a momentary glimpse of a face, not unlike his own, in that it was studious in nature, but otherwise very, very different. It had an unreal handsomeness to it, as only a sculpture or a painting could achieve. The figure drew a single symbol in the air, a dagger-like mark that for a single blink flared a bright white. What sounded like a great sigh swept through the cemetery. The graves stilled, the cloaked form vanished, and, at that point, Mendeln's surroundings changed. He was still in Partha, that much even his jolted mind would have guessed, but Odyssean's brother no longer stood within the cemetery. Instead, Mendeln was poised at its gateway. The gargoyle's grinning maw seemed to mock his sanity. The cemetery no longer looked ancient and overrun, but well kept, as one would expect in Partha. But no matter how hard he squinted, Mendeln could see no winged statue. Something touched his shoulder, causing him to yelp like a kicked hound. Strong fingers grasped Mendeln and turned him around. To his relief, it was Achilleos, not some fiend from the dead.
Mendeln, are you all right? What are you doing here?
The hunter looked almost as pale as Odyssean's brother felt. Achilleos' eyes darted past Mendeln to study the cemetery with utter loathing.
Did you go in there? No.
It seemed best to Mendeln not to try to explain, since he himself was not quite certain just what had taken place. A delusion? A dream? Insanity? Instead, Mendeln focused on a new, intriguing question.
Achilleos, my friend, why are you here? Did you follow me?
This time, it was the archer who hesitated before replying with an equally suspicious response.
Yes, I did.
Achilleos gave Mendeln a sudden grin, then slapped the farmer on the shoulder.
Don't want you getting lost, eh? Mendeln, town this size. Lots of things to distract you.
Mendeln was not certain whether he was supposed to be insulted by such comments, but he chose to ignore them for the sake of both men. Perhaps another time he could share his secrets with Achilleos, and the hunter could do the same with him. Those secrets, he believed, all focused on the fateful stone back home.
You need to come back with me to the square. Odyssean.
It shamed Mendeln that he had not been concerned about his brother. Nervously rubbing his hands together, he blurted,
Odyssean, is he all right? More than that,
Achilleos replied.
But you'll have to see to understand.
He happened to look down at Mendeln's hands. His brow arched.
Your hands are covered in dirt. What? I tripped on the street just before here, and I had to use my hands to keep from striking the stone with my face.
Mendeln quickly explained.
There was dirt there.
He added rather lamely. To his relief and surprise, the blonde bowman took his answer at face value too.
A fall in the street. You're getting too absent-minded for your own good. Here, let's find something to wipe your hands with and be on our way.
With nothing else around, Mendeln finally had to brush his hands against his garments. As a farmer, he was used to doing such, but felt a little embarrassed to be seen so in Partha. Yet they could not very well return to Master Ethan's home first. Mendeln dearly wanted to see what was happening in the square. He started to follow Achilleos, only to falter but a few steps later. Making certain his friend was not looking his way, Mendeln spun in a quick circle searching. The ghosts who had been with him since the battle in the wild were nowhere to be found. It was as if that, when the shrouded figure had sent the spirits of the graves to their rest, it had also done the same for the shades of the temple guards.
Thank you,
he whispered.
Did you say something?
Asked the archer, pausing to let him catch up.
No,
he replied with a vigorous shake of the head. Achilleos took the answer just as he had the others, and for which Odyssean's brother was grateful. Mendeln's mind stayed not with his sibling's situation, but the unsettling, indeed even sinister, episode through which he had just suffered. One thing about it haunted him most of all. Not what had happened, not exactly. No, it was a new question that the strange vision had raised. Or rather, two new questions bound together. What was the dragon, and why had it chosen him? Despite Achilleos' genial appearance, his mood was actually darker than when he had gone off in search of Mendeln. The archer had not at all expected to discover Odyssean's brother standing at the very entrance of such a place. It had brought back, full-blown for a second time, the horrific sensations that Achilleos had suffered after touching the stone. He had tried to cover up his abrupt anguish immediately, and was thankful that Mendeln had been so preoccupied that he had not noticed. Unfortunately, that preoccupation had drawn the hunter's attention in turn, and was what ate away at Achilleos even now. When asked if he had entered the cemetery, Mendeln had denied doing such a thing, yet Achilleos did not have to have a master hunter's honed sense to know that the dirt in the other's hand was not what would have been found in the street. It had a drier consistency, an aged look, and there had been some bits of weed and grass mixed in too. The sort of dirt that would have been more likely found, very easily, in a cemetery. That in turn caused Achilleos to remember another time, back in Sarum, when Brother Michaelius had wished to see the grave of the murdered missionary, and had proclaimed to the archer and the others there that someone had desecrated it. The Master Inquisitor had believed Odyssean was somehow responsible. Odyssean, or someone near to him. And now, here was Mendeln at another cemetery with dirt on his hands. Mendeln, who had been curiously absent during much of the events in the village. Mendeln, who in some ways was beginning to frighten Achilleos even more than Odyssean.